So the Mapping Freedom Project was my oral history Master of Arts thesis at the Columbia University in New York City. And again, it was to document and map all of the freedom colonies throughout the colonial pathways. For my thesis, I focused on Schenkelville, which is in deep East Texas on the border of Louisiana and Texas. The Raramore, which is an indigenous community that escaped the Spanish in northern Mexico in the Copper Canyons as the Spanish sort of tried to invade and conquer. Weeksville, which is a freedom colony in Brooklyn, New York, and Nicodemus, which is in Kansas, Kansas. So since the inception of Western colonialism, to sort of contextualize all this, the targeted peoples who were racialized as non-white would escape the terrorism of what I'm calling racialized, inherited, phenotypic, hypodescendant, one-drop rule, chattel Atlantic slave trade economy, Riffot caste, slave camp enslavement known as plantations. So the indigenous mass genocides, Jim Crow, Black codes, and other human rights abuses were developed by European colonists to justify the genocides and the taking of land and resources from the people and enslaving Africans. So these groups would escape and create their own colonies and thus successfully protect these safe spaces. So you, again, Palenques, Quilombos, and Macambos, and Maroons are some of the names that they're known throughout the different colonial pathways. Freedom countries like Haiti and Liberia are also being considered freedom colonies, and then the numerous freedmen settlements across the North American continent, and also some that exist in Africa and Australia.
At the core of their movement was the exploitation of indigenous land through the homestead process. In 1900, Black people totaled less than 200 in Chavez County, and most of them were represented at the beginning of the scheme. From the state of Washington to South Carolina, Black Demites advertised the organization of Afrotopia. On September 9th, 1903, Black Demites had erected their corporate veil, and the Santa Fe New Mexican reported the incorporation of the Blackton Townsite Company and its articles of incorporation with the names of 13 men and their intentions.
So San Basilio de Palenque was one of the first ones where the enslaved Africans sort of escaped the sort of torturous plantation, the slave camps, and ran into the hinterland to create what will become the Palenque de San Basilio. But there are so many more throughout the colonial pathways. There are 5,000 in the US at least. 580 have been found in Texas. The first in the US was Fort Mose, which is in what is now called Florida, which was found in 1738. So along the Western colonial circuits, these stories and these events are plethora. But in 2005, two white guys, Tad Simpson and James H. Conrad, tried to tell the story of the Texas freedom colonies. They actually call them freedom colonies. To the right is the book that they wrote about the independent Black Texans in the time of Jim Crow. And what they said sort of stood out to me and I used it throughout my thesis. They said, so compelling to historians has been this dark image of the degradation of landless Blacks, of the rise of sharecropping, debt slavery, the neo-plantation, and Jim Crow apartheid, that they often fail to notice a counter movement. Focused as they were on the triumph of sharecropping and the accompanying degradation of Blacks in the Deep South, historians neglected the countercurrent of Black landowner settlements. Numbers are difficult to estimate, but this ubiquitous, unremarked internal exodus to local freedom colonies must have dwarfed the famous move north. And this is them talking about the freedom colonies in Texas after slavery. So we know of Blackdom and Vado and New Mexico, and there are many, many, many other, again, I mean, up to 5,000 that have been sort of estimated here in the US, but they're sort of noticing that historians and storytellers and media ignored these stories because they were so focused and so compelled on telling the story of the degradation of Blacks and created this sort of dark and negative image. Texas A&M's Dr. Andrea Roberts has found over 580 of these communities in Texas with her Texas Freedom Colonies project. You can look up the Texas Freedom Colonies project. She also maps all of these communities in Texas, and she tells their stories at Texas A&M. So other scholars have started to share the findings of such regional communities as well, as we see with Dr. Timothy Nelson's Blackdom thesis project. But these communities have always sort of known about their, the importance of their communities. I'm a descendant of quite a few of these spaces, Shankerville, as well as relatives from Blackdom. And they have historical societies, homecomings, restoration projects, newsletters that I'm always inundated with that have been undertaken by these communities and their descendants. I was lucky enough to interview Erica Lively, who is a descendant of one of the Nicodemus founding families in Kansas and the Dry in Colorado. I don't think the clip will work today. I don't think we have too much time for it, but she created a sort of art project called Lost Goes to the Dry, where she sort of, which is an art exhibit about her ancestors' journeys to create Nicodemus and also then the Dry. So her great-grandmother, or great-great-grandmother, sort of helped to create the local newspaper, the Nicodemus Cyclone, which sort of documented this life in Kansas and Colorado of Black people within these freedom colonies settings. And she now has a 500-page tome of work that she has to now sort of share with the world to disrupt what she calls the silence around this event or this phenomenon.